Hey guys, hoping all is well with everybody. In this video, we're going to be continuing the read-along of The Secret Zoo by Brian Chick. And the last time we finished off with completing chapter 36, so today we're going to be starting with chapter 37. As always, please feel free to follow along, and I'll be showing you any pictures as we come across them. Chapter 37, A Man Who Answers Questions. The mist moistened Noah's cheeks as the dodos carried him down. The fog was so thick that he had to raise his hand to eye level just to glimpse his fingertips. When the fog began to break apart, the crests of the trees and the walls of the birdhouse became visible again. Finally, the ground of the force of flight came into view. It was grassy and covered with rocks and streams and idle birds. The air was heavy with the smell of rich, pure dirt, so fertile that even an accidental seed could take root. The dodos set the action scouts on the ground. They unwrapped the velvet curtain they used to carry Blizzard, and all the birds flew into the trees except one, which stood on his pencil-thin legs and glanced about as if he expected something. With his large hooked bill and minuscule wings, he looked every bit the dodo that he was regrettably named. "What do you suppose he wants?" Ella asked. "I don't know. Maybe he's sticking around to help us," Noah said. "To help us? Maybe to show us around. This is his house, you know." Noah stepped up to the dodo. "Do you have a name?" Ella paused before she said, "I hope you're not actually waiting for an answer." "I wonder if he even has a name." "Something better than Dodo," Noah said. Without warning, they heard a rough, gravely voice behind them. "You brats don't need to worry about names." It was Charlie Red, surrounded by a new squad of police monkeys. He snarled. Noah watched his lips peel off his teeth, half expecting to see fangs. "Charlie, how did you—" Noah's eyes darted toward the bamboo ramp, but all he could see was fog. "How did you get down here?" Charlie Red and his monkey clan slid closer. He leaned forward and, as he spoke, dotted Noah's cheeks with spit. "Let's just say I have shortcuts." To everyone's surprise, another voice erupted from behind Charlie. "You're not the only one who knows the shortcuts around here." The voice came from a man with a head as big and round and hairless as a pumpkin and biceps the size of softballs. "Tank!" Noah yelled. Tank smiled and winked at Noah. "I see you checked your mailbox. And judging by those duds you're sporting, Podgy found you something to wear." Furrowing his freckled brow, Charlie Red said, "Tank! What are you doing? I thought—" "That was your first mistake," Tank said. He crossed his meaty arms over his chest. "Don't waste your time thinking, bub." "But I thought you—" "It's over, Red," Tank said. "It's all over. They're inside now. They know." Suddenly a third voice rumbled behind Tank. "Indeed, it's all over." The old man stepped forward. He had thick gray hair tied in a ponytail and a bushy broom of a beard. Beaded sunglasses covered his eyes. A purple velvet trench coat draped his shoulders like a cloak. He turned to Charlie Red and said, "Charles, if you and your assistants will excuse us, I have much to speak about with our visitors." Charlie, looking intimidated, nervous, and angry all at the same time, could only give in, saying, "Yes, Mr. Darby." Then, with a broad sweep of his arms, he led his flustered police monkeys into the forest and out of sight. The old man, Mr. Darby, as Charlie had called him, stood comfortably with his hands clasped behind his back. "Ah, yes," he said. "Blizzard and Podgy. I might have guessed the two of you would be in on this." Mr. Darby's voice was warm and reassuring. He reached out and scratched Blizzard's cheek, just as one would scratch a kitten's chin. Blizzard closed his eyes halfway and droned a gentle growl. As a soft breeze wafted from the treetops, Marlowe swept down and perched on Noah's shoulder. "Well, good day, Marlowe," Mr. Darby said. The old man motioned to the dodo beside Noah. "Of course, Dodie is here, ready for whatever adventure may come his way." "Dodie?" Ella asked. "Yes," Mr. Darby said. "Dodie is this bird's name." "Do all the animals have names?" Richie asked. "Why, certainly. How else would we identify them?" He glanced at the massive branches that had fallen to the forest floor. They were completely entrenched in the earth. "You've certainly done your best to announce your arrival." "Sorry about that," Noah said. "The tree goons were chasing us," Ella piped up. Tree goons, said Mr. Darby. Charlie's red police monkeys, Noah exclaimed. Ah, yes, Mr. Darby said. Well, to Charlie's credit, he and his band of monkeys work security, as does our friend Mr. Pangborn, whom you know as Tank. Tank shot the action scouts a wink and a smile. Well, Mr. Darby said as he stroked his massy gray beard, allow me to formally introduce myself. I am Mr. Darby, and I am, well, let's say I'm the man who answers questions around here. I imagine the three of you must have some questions just about now. I can probably think of two, Alice said. Yeah, 1 or 200, Richie corrected her. Mr. Darby laughed. I hardly think we have time for 200 questions. He put one arm around Noah's shoulders and the other around Ella's and led the scouts along a path through the enormous trees. But if all of you will join me, I think I'll be able to answer many of them. Noah realized that he hadn't introduced himself. Mr. Darby, I'm Noah. These are my friends. Ella and Richie, Mr. Darby finished his sentence. Yes, Noah said. How does everyone here know us? Oh, the Action Scouts have been a topic of conversation around here for quite some time. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Pangborn? Tank smiled. His teeth looked like white jewels against his dark skin. You ain't kidding. Mr. Darby, Ella said, we don't even know where here is. Why, children, Mr. Darby replied, you're in the secret zoo. Chapter 38. Hummingbird Hideout. As Mr. Darby led the Action Scouts through the forest, he had no mention of the extraordinary building they were in. He said nothing about the birds circling overhead or about the police monkeys and the impossibly tall trees. He casually led them along a winding path, whistling a tune that was quite merry. The path stopped at a glass building that stood 50 feet high, a tiny edifice inside the forest aflight. Points of light reflected on the glass like stars. Mr. Darby opened a door and invited the scouts and their animal friends inside. Like the forest aflight, the building was lush with greenery, plants and trees that were shiny with dew. Little waterfalls splashed down rocky walls and spilled into narrow streams. Hummingbirds crowded the air. They darted back and forth and hovering in their magical flight. Occasionally they paused to drink honeysuckle nectar through their needle-fine beaks. Their wings thrummed over the flowers. Mr. Darby swept his arm in a circle and said, Welcome to Hummingbird Hideout. Marlowe hopped off Noah's shoulder, soared into the trees, and darted back and forth. Watching him frolic with hummingbirds, Noah wondered if he was excited to be the biggest bird in the sky for a change. The scouts followed the old man and Tank along a flagstone path to a clearing, where pillowed chairs were arranged beside a marble fountain. In the center of the fountain was a statue of a hummingbird, so richly painted that the sparkling water made it look soaked with blues and yellows and reds. A dozen people dressed in green lab coats stood in a cluster. They were studying hummingbirds, poking flowers with thin steel probes, and scribbling busily on green notepads. Excuse me, Mr. Darby said to them. I have business that requires a private meeting place. Might I use this area? One by one, the people in the lab coats noticed the scouts, and their faces lit up. They agreed to Mr. Darby's request and hurried out of sight, whispering in one another's ears and casting curious glances back at Noah, Ella, and Richie. Please, Mr. Darby said as he motioned toward the chairs, take a seat. Noah dropped onto the lush cushions as they swallowed his rear end. How come it's like everyone here knows us? He asked. A fair question, Mr. Darby said. He took a seat between Ella and Richie, who had sunk into their own fluffy chairs. But it might be better to start by defining where here is exactly. That'll work for me, Ella said hastily. Mr. Darby laughed, and his dark sunglasses slipped down his face. Before his eyes were revealed, he pushed them up again. You know, dear Ella, they've been saying you have certain impatience about you. More like an appetite for new things, Ella said. Mr. Darby laughed again. I thought Richie was the one with the flashy vocabulary. The flashy vocabulary and the flashy shoes, Ella quipped. Richie corrected her. Not anymore. Oh yeah, I forgot. Ella looked back at their host. Richie was mugged by an ape. I guess the streets aren't safe even around here, Mr. Darby. Nothing has more potential for danger than the curiosity of an animal, Mr. Darby replied. Except maybe the curiosity of my sister, Noah cut in. Do you know who she is, sir? Mr. Darby's face turned grave, and his features became sunken. Megan, he said flatly. The scouts bolted upright. You've seen her then? Noah asked. Not exactly. But she's okay, right? Richie asked. I don't know. What do you mean? Noah's voice trembled and his throat became dry. Mr. Darby folded his hands in his laps. Hummingbirds buzzed around him. 3 landed on his shoulders and softly pecked at his coat. There's so much to tell, he said. Where shall I start? How about the beginning? Richie asked. Certainly, Mr. Darby said. He leaned forward and a shadow fell across his face, making it so dark that he looked frightening. The hummingbirds whirled around him, their wings in a fluttery blur. But I must warn you, the story is filled with such magic and sadness that few believe it. Noah swept his hand around Hummingbird Hideout and said, Sitting in this crazy place, I don't think you'll have a problem convincing us. Good, Mr. Darby said. He stroked his beard. Then let us begin. Our story starts with a child, as so many stories do. The child's name was... Chapter 39. The Good Heart of Frederick Jackson. Frederick Jackson, Mr. Darby said. Frederick had warm eyes, a chubby face, and big freckles. He was sensitive and shy and very kind. In a way, it was Frederick Jackson's kindness that built the secret zoo. Frederick was raised mostly by his mother because his father was rarely home. You see, Frederick's father was a wealthy businessman. He owned several major construction companies, and he often traveled to distant cities. Though he loved his son dearly, his responsibilities kept them apart. One day, when Frederick was 9 years old, not much younger than 3 of you, his mother fell down the stairs in their house. His father was away on a business trip. His mother was hurt so badly that she couldn't move. She'd broken her legs and an arm, and she had other internal damage. Little Frederick was the only person who could help, but being so young and frightened, he didn't know what to do. He simply held his mother at the bottom of the stairs and screamed. By the time they were discovered, Frederick's mother had died. That's awful, Ellis said. Indeed, Mr. Darby said. So awful, in fact, that Frederick and Mr. Jackson sank into a deep depression. Mr. Jackson blamed himself for being away that day, and he secretly suspected that Frederick blamed him too. Distance came between them. Over time, the distance grew. In order to be home with Frederick, Mr. Jackson stopped traveling with his construction crews. His business began to suffer. What little was left of the Jackson family was crumbling. Frederick turned 10 and then 11. The distance increased between the father and son. One afternoon, nearly 3 years after Frederick's mother had died, Mr. Jackson took his son on a hike through the countryside. They came upon a barn where they were greeted by a farmer. The farmer tipped his straw hat and asked Mr. Jackson if he and his son would care to adopt a special pet. The farmer was selling his farm, and he couldn't take his pet with him. The animal was a langur. Noah glanced at Richie and said, A langur, like Mr. Talltail. That's right, Noah. Now, Frederick's father was a sensible man, Mr. Darby continued. He had no desire for a pet. But when Frederick caught sight of the langur leaping in the barn, he, for one reason or another, instantly fell in love with the critter. Frederick smiled. That was his first smile in 3 years. Mr. Jackson's heart swelled when he saw the joy on his son's face. The father was so touched that he took the animal home, no questions asked. What was the monkey's name? Richie asked. Why, it was a grand name. Simon. Mr. Darby trumpeted the monkey's name. Simon the Simian. Oh, that's perfect, Richie laughed. I don't get it, Ella admitted. A simian is a monkey, Richie explained. Simon the Simian? Get it? See how much more interesting life would be if you spent some time doing homework? Mr. Darby chuckled. As the hummingbirds whirled around him, their wings whirred in their soothing hum. A few of the tiny birds perched on the old man's shoulders, thighs, and head. For an instant, one even touched down on his nose. None of this interfered with his storytelling. In no time, Frederick and Simon became best friends. Mr. Darby continued. The monkey restored happiness in the boy's heart, but unfortunately this miraculous feat came at a cost. You see, Simon proved to be a most discourteous house guest. He had a fondness for shredding furniture, bashing china, and munching houseplants. He'd been in the Jackson home only a few months when Mr. Jackson decided that something must be done. But what? He couldn't send Simon away, not when the monkey was the only thing that made his son smile. Mr. Darby paused. He seemed delighted to be sharing his tale as if he were living in the telling. He opened his palms, and 3 hummingbirds landed on them, splashes of color against his pale skin. The old man smiled and playfully tossed them in the air. He turned his attention back to the action scouts. Simon, you see, was the reason for the creation of the Clarksville City Zoo. Your zoo. But how? Ella asked. Mr. Jackson decided to build Simon the simian a special place to live. His construction crews built a massive steel cage for the langur on the lavish acres of his own property. How cool to have a construction crew at your disposal, Richie blurted out. When the cage was built, Simon was moved into his new home. An outdoor pet was unusual indeed. Even more unusual was a pet langur. News spread quickly, and before long people lined up to peer over Mr. Jackson's fence for a look at Simon. Because Mr. Jackson was a generous man, he welcomed people onto his property for a closer look. Noah said, "I think I know where this is going. Simon ends up becoming the first animal in the Clarksville City Zoo, right?" Mr. Darby raised his gray eyebrows above his sunglasses. Precisely. "Where did all the other animals come from?" Ella asked. Well, before long, a man showed up on Mr. Jackson's doorstep with an exotic pet, a white fox. He could no longer care for the fox, and he pleaded with Mr. Jackson to take it. Frederick loved the fox the moment he saw it, which made it impossible for Mr. Jackson to refuse the animal. Word spread that Mr. Jackson was adopting strange animals, and as soon as people came from near and far with their unwanted pets, each new animal filled Frederick with such excitement that it was impossible for his father to turn any of them away. The private zoo grew and grew. Mr. Darby paused to look affectionately at a green hummingbird perched on his finger. "Hello, Speckle," he said. "How's my little friend doing today?" The hummingbird rustled his feathers, tipped his head a few times, and dashed out of sight. At the same time, Tank arrived, carrying a shiny tray crowded with tiny silver cups. He leaned forward and said, "Nectar, anyone?" "We didn't notice that you'd left," Noah said. "Mr. Darby tells a heck of a story, don't you think?" Tank replied. He looked at Ella as he motioned to the tray. "Nectar?" she asked. "From flowers?" "Yep." Ella twisted her face. "Gross!" "You'll have to trust me on this one," Tank said. With 2 fingers, he pinched the handle of one cup and lifted it. The action seemed too delicate for his beefy hands. "Take a sip. This stuff is sweet enough to make soda taste like water." Ella thought for a moment. Then she reluctantly took the cup and sipped gingerly from the brim. Her face lit up. "Wow!" she exclaimed, and she gulped a mouthful. "You are the man, Tank!" Tank offered the nectar to Noah and Richie, who suddenly looked anxious to try it. They snatched the cups from the tray and greedily sucked down the sweet juice. "Now then," Mr. Darby said, "where was I?" "Strange animals were being parked on Mr. Jackson's doormat," Ella said. "Yes, thank you, Ella." Before long, the Jacksons had become the proud owners of 20 animals. Among them were 4 black-footed ferrets, a peacock, a crocodile, a chimpanzee, and a white tiger. "He kept them in cages?" Noah asked. "All of them?" "Yes, each time a new animal arrived. Mr. Jackson put his construction crews to work." "And people from all around kept coming to his house to see the animals?" Ella asked. Mr. Darby laughed. "More and more came with every new animal. In fact, the private zoo became so well known that Mr. Jackson simply opened his property to the public and officially created the Clarksville City Zoo. With the opening of the zoo, Frederick was entirely relieved of his sadness. The animals had rescued him. Noah said, "The zoo worked out well for everyone then." "I'm afraid not." Mr. Darby crossed his legs and straightened his purple trench coat. He pushed up his glasses and frowned. "For a while, it did, yes, but something terrible happened. Something so terrible that is almost unspeakable." Mr. Darby tried to say more, but his words were caught in his throat. The scouts waited apprehensively. After a large silence, the old man said, "Frederick died." Richie gasped. "What? How?" "No one knows. He died in his sleep, and the doctors weren't able to figure out why. It happened just weeks before his 13th birthday." The scout sat motionless, in silence, trying to make sense of the story. "That's awful," Ellis said at last. Mr. Darby drew a deep breath and continued, "As you can imagine, Mr. Jackson did not take his son's death well. To lose his wife and son within a period of a few years not only broke the poor man's heart, but also broke his mind." "You mean he went crazy?" said Ella. "Yes, it was a terrible thing. But ironically, it was the illness that helped create the secret zoo." "Huh?" said Richie. "The mind of a madman is a complicated thing. You see, the animals constantly reminded Mr. Jackson of Frederick. They were, after all, the creatures that had restored happiness in the boy's heart. Mr. Jackson couldn't look at them without seeing his son, and so he fell in love with them. He began to collect new ones. He opened global agencies that specialized in adopting exotic pets and wounded wild animals. He spent millions on their care and support. Each new animal was kept in a cage on his property. All the townspeople realized that the poor man had gone mad, but given his plight, they understood why. In a strange way, they loved him more because of his illness." "What happened next?" Ella asked. "His collection of animals grew. 5 years after Frederick's death, Mr. Jackson had acquired over 100 animals, but as his collection increased, so did his madness. Then a couple of years later, his troubled mind shifted. His mental link between the animals and Frederick had become so strong that he believed he was keeping his own son captive. He couldn't bear that, not for an instant. There was only one thing for him to do." Mr. Darby paused. He looked intently at the scouts, rose from his seat, and raised his hands up to the treetops. Hummingbirds filled the air, and the buzz of their wings resounded like strange music. Some fluttered down and perched along the old man's arms and shoulders. Mr. Jackson used his misfortune of his own life to create a glorious place. With old magic, simple ambition, and a pure heart, he created the most magnificent structure time has known. Mr. Darby cupped his hands together. Mr. Jackson created the secret zoo. And I will end the video there, finishing chapter 39. But I will hope to see you guys in the next video where we continue with chapter 40. But I hope to see you guys soon, and as always, take good care of yourselves, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Take good care.